Hello and welcome back to our novel study of The Phantom Tollbooth. This is chapter 16, A Very Dirty Bird. But before we get to the dirty bird stuff, we have to finish finding out what happens to Milo. He is trying to visit the land of infinity, and the Mathemagician says that you can take a line that goes on forever, and when you reach the end, turn left, or you can take this flight of stairs, which appears from the wall. Milo takes the flight of stairs, and we said that it's kind of a paradox, which is something that doesn't seem like it makes sense, but then in reality it strangely does. When Milo says, "I'll be back in just a few minutes," now he's trying to go to a place called the Land of Infinity, which is forever, so how can he be back in just a few minutes? Well, let's find out by starting the chapter. Up he went, very quickly at first, then more slowly. Then, in a little while, even more slowly than that. And finally, after many minutes of climbing up the endless stairway, one weary foot was barely able to follow the other. Milo suddenly realized that, with all his effort, he was no closer to the top than when he began, and not a great deal further from the bottom. But he struggled on for a while longer, until at last, completely exhausted, he collapsed onto one of the steps. "I should have known it," he mumbled, resting his tired legs and filling his lungs with air. "This is just like the line that goes on forever, and I'll never get there." "You wouldn't like it much anyway," someone replied gently. "Infinity is a dreadfully poor place. They can never manage to make ends meet." So make ends meet is an idiom, which means to have enough money to cover your expenses or to get by financially. We say, "Oh, I'm making enough money at my job, so I'm making ends meet. I can pay the bills." But in this case, if it's a line with 2 points, those 2 points will never meet each other, and that's the joke that this character is making. They can never manage to make ends meet. Milo looked up, with his head still resting heavily in his hand. He was becoming quite accustomed to being addressed at the oddest times, in the oddest places, by the oddest people. And this time he was not at all disappointed. Standing next to him, on the step, was exactly one half of a small child who had been divided neatly from top to bottom. "Pardon me for staring," said Milo, after he had been staring for some time, "but I've never seen half a child before." "It's 0.58, to be precise," replied the child from the left side of his mouth, which happened to be the only side of his mouth. "I beg your pardon," said Milo. "It's 0.58, he repeated. "It's a little bit more than half." "Have you always been that way?" asked Milo impatiently, for he felt that that was a needlessly fine distinction. "My goodness, no," the child assured him. "A few years ago, I was just 0.42, and believe me, that was terribly inconvenient." "What is the rest of your family like?" said Milo, this time a bit more sympathetically. "Oh, we're just the average family," he said thoughtfully. "Mother, father, and 2.58 children. And, as I explained, I'm the 0.58. Okay, take a pause there and let's explain a couple things. First of all, you know that a half in decimal form is 0.50, so 0.58 or 58 hundredths is a little more than half. And this expression that the boy says that every average family has 2.58 children, well, we don't literally mean that there are half children in American families. What we mean is that if you took all of the families in the country and you saw how many kids each family had, the average number of kids would be an average of 2 children with 1 on the way. It must be rather odd being only part of a person, Milo remarked. Not at all, said the child. Every average family has 2.58 children, so I always have someone to play with. Besides, each family also has an average of 1.3 automobiles, and since I'm the only one who can drive 3/10 of a car, I get to use it all the time. But averages aren't real, objected Milo. They're just imaginary. That may be so, he agreed, but they're also very useful at times. For instance, if you didn't have any money at all, but you happened to be with 4 other people who had $10 apiece, then you'd each have an average of $8. Isn't that right? I guess so, said Milo weakly. Well, think how much better off you'd be, just because of averages, he explained convincingly. And think of the poor farmer when it doesn't rain all year. If there wasn't an average yearly rainfall of 37 inches in this part of the country, all his crops would wither and die. It all sounded terribly confusing to Milo, for he had always had trouble in school with just this subject. There are still other advantages, continued the child. For instance, if one rat were cornered by 9 cats, then, on the average, each cat would be 10% rat and the rat would be 90% cat. If you happened to be a rat, you could see how much nicer it would make things. But that can never be, said Milo, jumping to his feet. Don't be too sure, said the child patiently, for one of the nicest things about mathematics, or anything else you might care to learn, is that many of the things which can never be often are. You see, he went on, it's very much like you're trying to reach infinity. You know that it's there, but you just don't know where. But just because you can never reach it doesn't mean that it's not worth looking for. Now, let's discuss why Milo says that averages aren't real. So, an average is a number expressing the central or typical value in a set of data, which is calculated by dividing the sum of the values in the set of their number. So what does that mean? It basically means taking all of the different numbers of something, adding them up, and then dividing that sum by however many numbers you added. And the best example of averages is one that you're probably the most familiar with, which is your grades. Your grades are based on an average system. And the way that works is, look at student 1. Student 1 got a 90, an 83, and a 65 on quizzes. If you add those together, you get 238, and you divide by how many quizzes there were. There were 3 quizzes. And so the average is 79. It doesn't mean that that student ever got an actual 79 on any of the quizzes. It just means that of all the grades that they got, the 90, the 83, and 65, between all of those grades, 79 is the average of all of those grades. And student 2, who got a 90, an 80, and a 77, that comes out to 247 divided by their 3 quizzes. They got an 82. And I just think it's hilarious to notice that I picked those numbers for the quizzes completely randomly, but when the averages came out, the decimal point, 3333333, happened on both student averages. And whenever you see a decimal that repeats like that, it repeats infinitely. So we're doing a chapter where Milo is trying to get to infinity, and I just randomly chose 2 student averages that had infinity decimals. And that's an important paragraph that this average boy just told us, because that's true about mathematics. And we talked in the last chapter about how we can sort of understand infinity as a concept, but we can't really fully experience or comprehend infinity. We can't really experience anything going on forever without end. But mathematics, when we learn mathematics, it shows us that infinity does exist in the universe, as shown by the averages that we just talked about. And mathematics and science do that with all kinds of things that when we didn't know they existed, we suddenly discover, using tools and instruments and theories and calculations and equations, we discover that there are things that do exist even though we can't actually see them or experience them with the rest of our senses. And so that's an important theme, which is that through mathematics, you can discover new ideas, new concepts, new ways of manipulating reality itself. I hadn't thought of it that way, said Milo, starting down the stairs. I think I'll go back now. A wise decision, the child agreed. But try again someday. Perhaps you'll get much closer. And as Milo waved goodbye, he smiled warmly, which he usually did, on the average of 47 times a day. Okay, so just for the quiz, make sure that you understand that who Milo meets on the way to infinity. He meets 0.58 of an average boy, and you should know that Milo never actually reaches infinity. He turns around and goes back. Everyone here knows so much more than I do, thought Milo as he leaped from step to step. I'll have to do a lot better if I'm going to rescue the princesses. In a few moments, he'd reached the bottom again and burst into the workshop where Tok and the humbug were eagerly watching the Mathemagician perform. Ah, back already? He cried, greeting him with a friendly wave. I hope you found what you were looking for. I'm afraid not, admitted Milo. And then he added in a very discouraged tone, everything in Digitopolis is much too difficult for me. The Mathemagician nodded knowingly and stroked his chin several times. You'll find, he remarked gently, that the only thing you can do easily is be wrong, and that's hardly worth the effort. That's an important theme right there. It's easy to be wrong. It's easy to waste your time. It's easy to not put in any effort. But then once you do that, there are all kinds of consequences that come along with it. So in the moment, it's easy to be lazy, or it's easy not to study, or it's easy to try and cut corners or do something at the last minute. But then later on, you get bad grades, your parents get upset with you, you have a parent-teacher conference. There are always consequences to our actions. And so it's not worth, what the Mathemagician is saying is that it's not worth being wrong. It's worth putting in the effort to try and do something right or correctly the first time so that you don't have to deal with all the consequences for doing something wrong, because the consequences for doing something wrong are always worse than the effort it takes to just do it right the first time. Milo tried very hard to understand all the things he'd been told and all the things he'd seen, and as he spoke, one curious thing still bothered him. Why is it, he said quietly, that quite often even the things which are correct just don't seem to be right? A look of deep melancholy, one of your vocabulary words, crossed the Mathemagician's face, and his eyes grew moist with sadness. Everything was silent, and it was several minutes before he was able to reply at all. How very true, he sobbed, supporting himself on the staff. It has been that way since rhyme and reason were banished. Quite so, began the humbug. I personally feel that... And all because of that stubborn wretch, Azaz, roared the Mathemagician, completely overwhelming the bug. For now his sadness had changed to fury, and he stalked about the room, adding up anger and multiplying wrath. It's all his fault. Perhaps if you discussed it with him, Milo started to say, but never had time to finish.
He's much too unreasonable, interrupted the Mathemagician again. Why, just last month I sent him a very friendly letter, which he never had the courtesy to answer. See for yourself.
He handed Milo a copy of the letter, which read... Now, I'm not going to read out all those numbers, but I'm sure you get the joke there, is that because the Mathemagician hates words, he's going to write his letter in numbers. And you can imagine and infer that if Azaz gets a letter that is just full of numbers, he's probably going to crumple it right up and not even attempt to read it. But maybe he doesn't understand numbers, said Milo, who found it a little difficult to read himself.
Nonsense, he bellowed. Everyone understands numbers. No matter what language you speak, they always mean the same thing. A 7 is a 7 anywhere in the world.
My goodness, thought Milo. Everybody is so terribly sensitive about the things they know best.
With your permission, said Tok, changing the subject, we'd like to rescue Rhyme and Reason.
Has Azaz agreed to it?
The Mathemagician inquired.
Yes, sir,
the dog assured him.
Then I don't, he thundered again. For since they've been banished, we've never agreed on anything, and we never will.
He emphasized his last remark with a dark and ominous look. Never? Asked Milo, with the slightest touch of disbelief in his voice.
Never, he repeated. And if you can prove otherwise, you have my permission to go.
Well, said Milo, who had thought about this problem very carefully ever since leaving Dictionopolis, then, with whatever Azaz agrees, you disagree.
Correct,
said the Mathemagician with a tolerant smile. And with whatever Azaz disagrees, you agree.
Also correct,
yawned the Mathemagician, nonchalantly cleaning his fingernails with the point of his staff. Then each of you agrees that he will disagree with whatever each of you agrees with, said Milo triumphantly. And if you both disagree with the same thing, then aren't you really in agreement?
I've been tricked,
cried the Mathemagician helplessly, for no matter how he figured, it still came out just that way. You should be able to explain in your own words for an open-ended response the logic of how Milo convinces the Mathemagician to rescue Rhyme and Reason. And his reasoning is, look, if you guys are going to disagree about everything, Azaz agrees that he's going to disagree with everything, and you agree that you're going to disagree about everything. So you're both agreeing to disagree. And when the Mathemagician thinks that through, he realizes he has no choice but to allow Milo to rescue Rhyme and Reason.
Splendid effort,
commented the humbug jovially.
Exactly the way I would have done it myself. And now may we go?
Added Tok. The Mathemagician accepted his defeat with grace, nodded weakly, and then drew the three travelers to his side.
It's a long and dangerous journey,
he began softly, and a furrow of concern creased his forehead.
Long before you find them, the demons will know you're there. Watch for them well, he emphasized, for when they appear, it may be too late.
The humbug shuddered down to his shoes, and Milo felt the tips of his fingers suddenly grow cold.
But there is one problem, even more serious than that, he whispered ominously.
What is it? Gasped Milo, who was not sure he really wanted to know.
I'm afraid I can tell you only when you return. "Come along," said the Mathemagician, "and I'll show you the way."
And simply by carrying the three, he transported them all to the very edge of Digitopolis. Behind them lay all the kingdoms of wisdom, and up ahead a narrow, rutted path led toward the mountains and darkness. Let's take a pause there. So, first of all, the pun, simply by carrying the three, which is an expression we would use in column addition method, but in the book, the Mathemagician literally carries the three, Milo, Tok, and the Humbug. Notice the connection back to King Azaz, who said the exact same thing to Milo, that there was a far more serious problem and that he couldn't tell him what it was until after he returned, and the Mathemagician just said exactly the same thing. So I asked you back then to make an inference what that far more serious problem was, and I'm asking you again to make an inference about what that far more serious problem is. Is it the same problem? Or is it two different problems? "We'll never get the car up that," said Milo unhappily.
"True enough," replied the Mathemagician, "but you can be in ignorance quick enough without riding all the way, and if you're to be successful, it will have to be step by step."
Which is a sort of hidden theme, meaning that in order to be successful at anything in life, you have to practice, you have to do what we call take baby steps, and just take step by step towards your goal. Don't worry about the difficulty of reaching that huge obstacle. Just worry about the first step that you need to take, and then the next steps that you need to take, one step at a time. "But I would like to take my gifts," he insisted. "So you shall," announced the dodecahedron, who appeared from nowhere with his arms full. "Here are your sights, here are your sounds, and here," he said, handing Milo the last of them disdainfully, "are your words."
"And, most important of all," added the Mathemagician, "here is your own magic staff. Use it well, and there is nothing it can't do for you."
He placed in Milo's breast pocket a small, gleaming pencil, which, except for the size, was much like his own. Then, with a last word of encouragement, he and the dodecahedron, who was simultaneously sobbing, frowning, pining, and sighing from 4 of his saddest faces, made their farewells and watched as the 3 tiny figures disappeared into the forbidding mountains of ignorance. So simultaneously means happening at the same time, and that's why 4 of the dodecahedron's faces are frowning, pining, and sighing and sobbing all at the same time. And of course, for the quiz, make sure you remember that the Mathemagician gives Milo a gift, just like Milo received 3 other gifts that we can see up here in a quick review. Okay, folks, at this point we are deep into the beginning of Act 3, where the tension and the suspense are going to increase and do so quickly. Almost immediately, the light began to fade as the difficult path wandered aimlessly upward, inching forward almost as reluctantly as the trembling humbug. Tok, as usual, led the way, sniffing ahead for danger, and Milo, his bag of precious possessions slung over one shoulder, followed silently and resolutely behind. "Perhaps someone should stay back to guard the way," said the unhappy bug, offering his services, but since his suggestion was met with silence, he followed glumly along. Notice the humbug trying to get out of having to continue going with them. The higher they went, the darker it became, though it wasn't the darkness of night, but rather more like a mixture of lurking shadows and evil intentions which oozed from the slimy moss-covered cliffs and blotted out the light. A cruel wind shrieked through the rocks, and the air was thick and heavy, as if it had been used several times before. On they went, higher and higher up the dizzying trail. On one side, the sheer stone walls and brutal peaks towering above them, and on the other, an endless, limitless, bottomless nothing. Now let's take a pause. The next part will have a lot of puns that I have divided, which you can see up on the screen as I'm reading. "I can hardly see a thing," said Milo, taking hold of Tock's tail as a sticky mist engulfed the moon. "Perhaps we should wait until morning."
"There'll be morning for you soon enough,"
came a reply from directly above, and this was followed by a hideous cackling laugh, very much like someone choking on a fishbone. Clinging to one of the greasy rocks and blending almost perfectly with it was a large, unkempt, one of your vocabulary words, and exceedingly soiled bird who looked more like a dirty floor mop than anything else. He had a sharp, dangerous beak, and the one eye he chose to open stared down maliciously, which is another one of your vocabulary words, which means intending to cause harm. "I don't think you understand," said Milo timidly as the watchdog growled a warning. "We're looking for a place to spend the night."
"It's not yours to spend,"
the bird shrieked again, and followed it with the same horrible laugh. "That doesn't make any sense. You see," he started to explain.
"Dollars or cents, it's still not yours to spend,"
the bird replied haughtily. "But I didn't mean," insisted Milo.
"Of course you're mean,"
interrupted the bird, closing the eye that had been open and opening the one that had been closed.
"Anyone who'd spend a night that doesn't belong to him is very mean."
"Well, I thought that by—" he tried again desperately.
"That's a different story,"
interjected the bird a bit more amiably.
"If you want to buy, I'm sure I can arrange to sell, but with what you're doing, you'll probably end up in a cell anyway."
"That doesn't seem right," said Milo helplessly, for, with the bird taking everything the wrong way, he hardly knew what he was saying.
"Agreed,"
said the bird with a sharp click of his beak.
"But neither is it left. Although, if I were you, I would have left a long time ago."
"Let me try once more," he said in an effort to explain. "In other words—"
"You mean you have other words?" cried the bird happily. "Well, by all means, use them. You're certainly not doing very well with the ones you have now."
"Must you always interrupt like that?"
said Tock irritably, for even he was becoming impatient.
"Naturally," he cackled. "It's my job. I take the words right out of your mouth. Haven't we met before? I'm the Everpresent Wordsnatcher, and I'm sure I know your friend, the bug."
And then he leaned all the way forward and gave a terrible, knowing smile. The humbug, who was too big to hide and too frightened to move, denied everything. "Is everyone who lives in ignorance like you?" asked Milo.
"Much worse," he said longingly. "But I don't live here. I'm from a place very far away called Context."
"Don't you think you should be getting back?" suggested the bug, holding one arm up in front of him.
"What a horrible thought!"
The bird shuddered.
It's such an unpleasant place that I spend almost all my time out of it. Besides, what could be nicer than these grimy mountains?
Almost anything, thought Milo as he pulled his collar up, and then he asked the bird, "Are you a demon?"
I'm afraid not,
he replied sadly, as several filthy tears rolled down his beak.
I've tried, but the best I can manage to be is a nuisance.
And before Milo could reply, he flapped his dingy wings and flew off in a cascade of dust and dirt and fuzz.
Wait!
Shouted Milo, who'd thought of many more questions he wanted to ask.
34 pounds!
Shrieked the bird as he disappeared into the fog. He was certainly no help, said Milo, after they had been walking again for some time. Okay, so the ever-present Wordsnatcher is not a demon, but you do need to know about him for the quiz. And ever-present, of course, means always around. To snatch something is to take it without permission, sometimes by force. And he is, number one, a soiled and unkempt bird who takes the words out of your mouth. Unkempt meaning dirty, messy, sloppy. And take the words right out of your mouth is an idiom that means you know what someone is going to say and therefore you say it first. And so that person can be, oh, you took the words right out of my mouth. It can also be used when you completely agree with somebody. If they just said something that you completely agree with, you can say, oh, exactly, you took the words right out of my mouth. But in this case, this ever-present Wordsnatcher literally takes the words out of your mouth, and we're going to find out how, which is number two. He takes the words out of your mouth by making bad puns, by purposely, quote, taking everything the wrong way. So if somebody says something to you and you get upset by it and they say, oh, well, you're just taking it the wrong way. I didn't mean it that way. The bird purposely takes your words the wrong way and makes puns out of them. And a pun, of course, you know by now, is when you take advantage of the different possible meanings of a word or the fact that there are words which sound alike but have different meanings. And so that was the list of puns that I put up for you as we were reading. He took every single one of Milo's words and twisted it by using the homonym that meant something different. And finally, the ever-present Wordsnatcher says he's from a place called context, but he spends most of his time out of it. Now, we've heard of context clues, which is figuring out a word by looking at the words or the sentences around the unknown word. Context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. So context is the meaning or the truth that surrounds a specific event or situation. And so that if you use the idiom out of context, it means that somebody took what you said, but they didn't include everything else that came before or after it, or they didn't talk about the situation around it. All they talked about was the one thing that was said, and so you can't really understand what is said unless you understand the context around it. And so that's why the ever-present Wordsnatcher doesn't like living there, because when you understand a word in context, then things make sense. And the bird doesn't want things to make sense, so he wants to live out of context. So the main idea here, every demon, even though he's not a demon, but every demon has a main idea associated with it. And so the main idea here is that the ever-present Wordsnatcher confuses others by purposely taking everything they say out of context. Let's continue where we last left off. He was certainly no help, said Milo after they had been walking again for some time.
That's why I drove him off,
cried the humbug, fiercely brandishing his cane.
Now, let's find the demons.
Of course, the humbug did no such thing. That might be sooner than you think, remarked Tok, looking back at the suddenly trembling bug, and the trail turned again and continued to climb. In a few minutes they'd reached the crest, only to find that beyond it lay another one, even higher, and beyond that several more, whose tops were lost in the swirling darkness. For a short stretch the path became broad and flat, and just ahead, leaning comfortably against a dead tree, stood a very elegant-looking gentleman. He was beautifully dressed in a dark suit with a well-pressed shirt and tie. His shoes were polished, his nails were clean, his hat was well brushed, and a white handkerchief adorned his breast pocket. But his expression was somewhat blank. In fact, it was completely blank, for he had neither eyes, nose, nor mouth.
"Hello, little boy," he said, amiably shaking Milo by the hand. "And how's the faithful dog?" he inquired, giving Tok 3 or 4 strong and friendly pats. "And who is this handsome creature?" he asked, tipping his hat to the very pleased humbug. "I'm so happy to see you all."
What a pleasant surprise to meet someone so nice, they all thought, and especially here.
"I wonder if you could spare me a little of your time," he inquired politely, "and help with a few small jobs?"
Why, of course,
said the humbug cheerfully.
gladly.
Said Tok. Yes, indeed, said Milo, who wondered for just a moment how it was possible for someone so agreeable to have a face with no features at all.
"Splendid," he said happily, "for there are just 3 tasks. Firstly, I would like to move this pile from here to there," he explained, pointing to an enormous mound of fine sand. "But I'm afraid that all I have is this tiny tweezers."
And he gave them to Milo, who immediately began transporting 1 grain at a time.
"Secondly, I would like to empty this well and fill the other, but I have no bucket, so you'll have to use this eyedropper."
And he handed it to Tok, who undertook at once to carry 1 drop at a time from well to well.
"And lastly, I must have a hole through this cliff, and here is a needle to dig it."
The eager humbug quickly set to work, picking at the solid granite wall. When they had all been safely started, the very pleasant man returned to the tree and, leaning against it once more, continued to stare vacantly down the trail, while Milo, Tok, and the humbug worked hour after 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 hour.